Hello, and welcome to the President's Class, now solely on YouTube for the pandemic. Thank you for joining us for our ongoing series, Seeking Wisdom in Troubled Times. We hope you are all safe and well. A ritual is the enactment of a myth, and by participating in the ritual, you are participating in the myth. And since myth is a projection of the depth wisdom of the psyche, by participating in a ritual, participating in the myth, you are being, as it were, put in accord with that wisdom, which is the wisdom that is inherent within you anyhow. Your consciousness is being reminded of the wisdom of your own life. I think ritual is terribly important. Joseph Campbell. Stories can be interesting and instructive to hear and discuss, and at PRS we revel in doing so. But for stories to be activated and their wisdom applied, they must be embodied and lived. We have seen that at the deepest level, myths exist beneath other more visible stories to shape our worlds. They are the background hum of culture and of life itself, so profoundly true that we do not often recognize or question them. Surfacing these stories and bringing them to light is both disturbing and liberating because it involves shattering illusions and breaking their chains. Carl Jung famously wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." When change occurs and these old stories surface, our immediate response is to cling to them because there is seemingly nothing else to hold on to. Failing though they are, a broken and illusory sense of self and culture appears better than the fearful nothing or chaos that lies ahead. Like so many of our assumptions, however, this one is false. Though we can see just their faint outlines, at present new stories have been gestating all along and are waiting to be born. Ritual is the birth ceremony for new stories, and without it, the story aches inside us and inside our culture, producing more and more fear and pain until it finally emerges. The visceral imagery here is appropriate because in ritual, we ante up our bodies to bet on the significance of the emerging story. We put our bodies themselves in touch with the sacred. So it is an especially cruel irony that now our bodies, so long the vehicles of the sacred, have in the pandemic become vectors for disease and death. Myths and rituals that give birth to hope, however, do not die. They are always available to us in some form. And if we do not let them emerge, we will, as individuals and cultures, become sicker. On the 19th century American plains, a boy of 5 had a powerful experience. He was out hunting and about to shoot a bird when it began speaking to him, saying, "The clouds all over are one-sided. Listen, a voice is calling you." 2 men came down from the clouds like arrows and sang, "Behold, a sacred voice is calling you." All over the sky, a sacred voice is calling. The boy later says, "I sat there gazing at them, and they were coming from the place where the giant lives, the north. But when they were very close to me, they wheeled about toward where the sun goes down, and suddenly they were geese. Then they were gone, and the rain came with a big wind and a roaring. I did not tell this vision to anyone. I liked to think about it, but I was afraid to tell it." That amazing vision, that amazing event occurred when the boy was 5. At 9, he sees a vision for his people that is elaborate and powerful, involving the past, the future, and many figures and events. Voices urge him to take action, but he remains too afraid and keeps it all to himself. The voices and visions continue, and still he keeps them a secret because of his fear. At 17, he says he was then so afraid of being afraid that he shares his vision with a shaman who immediately knows what to do. He must act out his vision, his sacred story, in a ceremony for the entire tribe. He does, and is cured. Some of you will recognize this story from Black Elk Speaks, and I am ambivalent about sharing it with you for a couple of reasons. For one, we are not sure how much of this story is Black Elk's and how much is his translator's, John Neihardt. Secondly, and related to the first, it is a bit much, especially if you read the entire vision, which is unlike anything that we or even Black Elk's peers experienced. I believe Black Elk experienced something profoundly sacred. I'm just not sure where his vision ends and Neihardt's creative writing begins. Those concerns notwithstanding, I tell that story here because I think it can serve as a profound parable about the sacred stories and ceremonies. Put simply, Black Elk's sacred vision was not for him alone, but fear kept him from telling it, and that made him sick and his people suffer. Once he shared his vision with the appropriate person, it became a ceremony, and he and they were healed. Most of us do not experience visions, especially ones that must be acted out for our community. Most of us are just afraid, and there's plenty to be afraid of. But fear makes us sick. And when we are sick, what we need is a good ceremony. I'm taking this notion and the title of this lecture from Laguna Pueblo writer Leslie Marmon Silko's acclaimed novel, Ceremony. If you have been to PRS for a lecture or viewed one on YouTube, there's a chance that you have heard me reference or even lecture on this novel before. In fact, the novel has been the inspiration for much of our ideas in this series, especially about the delicacy and strength of words and the worlds that they create. The larger story of the novel, however, is one about fear, the illness it breeds, and the ceremonies that heal and bring the world back into balance. In the novel, the main character, Teo, is a Laguna Pueblo who has cursed the rain on the Bataan Death March in the Philippines during World War II. And he watched his beloved cousin Rocky sink into the mud and into death after an assault by Japanese soldiers. It was not the rain that killed Rocky, and it was not Teo who caused the subsequent drought in Laguna after he returns. But none of that matters to a person sick with fear and guilt. Teo is profoundly unwell and beyond the abilities of both the army psychiatrist and the old Laguna Pueblo medicine man. He needs a ceremony, and a new kind of ceremony, one for his time and place. And the bulk of the novel involves the detailed performance of a healing ceremony over many weeks and miles. The voice of Thought Woman, a Pueblo goddess, is heard at the beginning of the novel. What she said: "The only cure I know is a good ceremony." That's what she said. Goddess knows what we need is a good ceremony. I thought I knew something about what that meant, but recent events have revealed new and subtle notions about ceremonies that I had not appreciated until now, here in the pandemic. For we who live in the annus horribilis of 2020, we are prohibited from ritual by the threat of contagion. Our body, the axis mundi of our perceptual world, is now a vector for contagion and even death. Illness and possible death have literally come between us. If we do engage each other, it is at a great distance or behind facial coverings of some kind. Our world is now too dangerous for traditional ritual or any kind of intimate group gathering. If you're like me at all, you now have an acute awareness of this loss, the vital element of simply being together in space and time. This loss is especially acute for PRS. Not only do we miss the warmth and beauty of our space, we miss you in this space. We miss our common sacred time and territory, whether it is a regular Tuesday night lecture, a Mandy Khan poetry event, or quiet reading with others in the library. If you're like me at all, you've been thrown from depression and fear to determination and hope to vague numbness, sometimes within the same day. Without a ritual to address that situation, we veer wildly between emotions and thoughts scatter like leaves. There's much happening to us individually, culturally, globally, and while we may not have seen a vision, we are thinking and feeling in new ways as we move through this liminal zone. Such is the nature of liminality. We are changing. Old stories are passing away, new stories are emerging, monsters appear, depression weighs, hope rises. The most ancient and effective technology for dealing with change is myth and ritual. And as Black Elk saw, to have one without the other is to be unwell. If you're anything like me at all, you are suffering from the lack of contact with other human beings in a common space. Before 2020, I would not have defined that as ritual because it did not meet the anthropological definitions. Now I see how sacred it is, even without the formal elements. For example, I am fortunate to live in one of Los Angeles's many courtyard apartment complexes, and these can be unique and vital communities, even without ceremonies or stories. Because in our building, we all look out on a common space, we see and hear everything and everyone who passes through, but we were not really together. On the contrary, we were locked inside our units and in our minds. Early on in the pandemic, I decided to buy pizza, Lucifer's Pizza, of course, for our small complex, just to acknowledge that in these troubled times we could be in some sort of relation. We masked up, washed our hands, physically distanced, and shared our pizza hygienically in the courtyard. "Why are you doing this?" someone asked, fairly. "To be human and in communion," I replied. I do not know if they thought it was just another cryptic statement from the president of that strange place on Los Feliz Boulevard, but we ate the pizza together. We were bodies in the same space sharing a meal, an ancient ritual. More importantly, our little Eucharist service made everyone feel connected again, if only for a couple of hours, though I suspect its effects are deeper and longer lasting than that. Another example is PRS itself. The last lecture I filmed in the auditorium was on Black Elk, and it went for nearly 90 minutes, probably because I had no audience from which to glean body language, not to mention I just enjoy talking about Black Elk. But an empty auditorium and an empty campus, such a cruel irony for an 86-year-old institution that is built on community, sharing, and growing. Staff go in occasionally for our minimal business functions. And I happened to be on campus on a recent Friday when we accidentally left the front gate open during our curbside pickup. A few of us were sitting in the library talking, and a couple walked in, a professor from the University of Washington and a doctoral candidate from my alma mater, Emory University. At the moment they appeared, I have to say that I was not myself. Tossed about by emotional and cultural winds, I was also sleepless and groggy, and so also a bit surly. I was not interested in entertaining interlopers. I just wanted to go home and try to sleep, which had been increasingly elusive. In other words, what I needed was a good little ceremony. It turns out our visitors had been merely taking a stroll through the neighborhood and had decided to see what this strange place was all about. It is a response we got almost daily before the pandemic, but now it seemed like everything else, a chore. Soon enough, however, I found myself getting up to greet them and beginning to answer their questions. They responded with awe and joy. Interestingly, I responded with awe and joy as well. I showed them the library, the big book, the bookstore, and the auditorium. Though we were masked and distancing, we were at least in each other's presence and sharing a story. The story of PRS, of seekers and intellectual curiosity, of being human despite the forces arrayed against us. Such is the divine alchemy of human beings in story and in space. My little ritual experience was uplifting, and my sense of well-being carried through the evening. I did not know I had needed a good ceremony, but one was provided for me anyway, and it was healing. In this lecture, I hope to help us understand the power of ritual, especially in these troubled times that prevent typical rituals from occurring. To do so, we will look at two theorists and apply their insights. And we will see that ritual is more than its form. It is, in fact, and always has been, the way we navigate change itself. Let us begin with what rituals are and what they do. Ritual derives from the word rite, which has always meant a religious ceremony of one kind or another. We tend to look down upon religious rites as perfunctory at best and dangerous at worst. But that judgment says more about what has come to matter to us more than the nature of ritual. For example, though we would not call it religious, concerts and sporting events were pre-pandemic rituals by every definition of the word. They took us out of ourselves and into sacred space and time together. Suzanne Langer, in Philosophy in a New Key, argues that ritual is the very language of religion. And we know that religion is about two things: awe at the profound experience of the other, and reconnection to the world and ourselves after such an experience of awe. This statement may ring hollow to our contemporary ears, but it is certainly true for most of the history on our planet. As fun as it could be, I will not go into all the theories of ritual, but exploring their nature and function is worthwhile, especially since we're missing so much of what they've offered us even before the pandemic. Arnold van Gennep was, like many of his contemporary anthropologists, actually a folklorist concerned with understanding the folkways of primal cultures. The idea was to draw upon the particulars of ethnographers in the field who were collecting information on myths, rituals, and social dynamics, then inductively create a theory based on those specifics. Van Gennep did that, and his theory was simple and powerful. He wrote in The Rites of Passage that such rites have 3 stages: separation, initiation, and return. Separation involves removing the inductee from her everyday world, which is safe, predictable, and knowable. Safe, predictable, and knowable because change literally cannot occur when everything stays the same. Initiation involves introducing the inductee to a new world, one that is unsafe, unpredictable, and unknown, and requires the participant to find her own way, thereby developing individual traits of power, courage, and self-reliance, among others. Return involves reintroducing the inductee to her original community, where she is now a full-fledged member by virtue of her rite of passage, and where she can benefit the community by her own lessons learned in the initiation. Joseph Campbell elaborated on these 3 stages in developing his understanding of the hero's journey. Van Gennep seems to have uncovered a vital element in the nature of ceremonies that we live by even today and demonstrate in a small way in our personal ceremonies and in the stripped down and spontaneous ones that I mentioned earlier. Ceremonies take us from one state of being to another. And the other state of being is often a higher level with more awareness and more communitas, as Victor Turner will say. More on him shortly. But the ultimate point here is that even with small and unplanned ceremonies, we are engaging in ritual. We are separating ourselves, even momentarily, from our everyday world, plagued as it is right now, initiating ourselves into a new reality born of contact with the other, then returning to our everyday world refreshed with wisdom, or at least momentary relief from the concerns of the quotidian. The idea is to remind ourselves that what we experience every day is not the ultimate reality. Occasionally, we need to enter the sacred space of ritual to enlarge our vision, diminish our ego, and free ourselves from its tyranny. The little unplanned ceremonies I shared before fit this pattern. It is not surprising that ceremonies have been connected to healing as well, because healing is moving from one state of being to another. But we've largely replaced this ritual function with work and love. We expect a person or a job to be our change agents more than anything else. Accordingly, any ritual we do perform is perfunctory instead of dramatic and robust, as they have been in previous eras. In fact, what we often find is that new states of being have been sold to us as consumer goods, relationships, job promotions, money, and others. This cynical or superficial marketing of change assumes that everything else is equal. That is, that neither we nor the world are sick. And in fact, we and the world are always fractured and in need of some kind of healing. In Leslie Marmon Silko's novel, when Thoughtwoman says that Teo needs a good ceremony, it is not because he's ready to advance to a new level of awareness and awesomeness. Rather, it's because he is shattered beyond his own recognition and ability to function. He feels that he is white smoke, invisible to the broken world that he created by cursing the rain and creating the drought in Laguna. See if here in the pandemic you can relate to his feeling of disorientation in the following passage that comes early on in the novel. He could feel it inside his skull, the tension of little threads being pulled, and how it was with tangled things tied together. And as he tried to pull them apart and rewind them into their places, they snagged and tangled even more. So Teo had to sweat through those nights. Then thoughts became entangled. He had to sweat to think of something that wasn't unraveled or tied in knots to the past, something that existed by itself, standing alone like a deer. And if he could hold that image of the deer in his mind long enough, his stomach might shiver less and let him sleep for a while. Healing ceremonies do in fact bring you to a new state of being, if it's only being well instead of sick. But the proximate cause of the sickness is addressed only by putting your body back in touch with the sacred and in relation to other life and the world itself. For Teo, it means stopping the spinning world to focus on a deer standing alone, and ultimately, of course, much more. Teo is in liminality, where he has lost his story and his moorings. It's the late John Prine saying, just give me one thing that I can hold on to. To believe in this living is just a hard way to go. Sickness then is imbalance, disharmony, inability to see your place in the world, breaking the fragile web of life. What is needed is a recreation of creation itself, putting things back into the delicate but sustainable web as in the beginning, a reboot, if you will. We have to be careful here, though, because healing ceremonies such as a Navajo sand painting ritual that appears in the novel Ceremony do not take us back to the beginning. Rather, they take us back to balance. In this sense, they take us forward. Linear assumptions of time have us longing for lost Edens and golden ages and recreating them in new heavens and new earths. Ceremonies are, if they are time-oriented at all, forward-looking. Wedded as they are to specific places and times, rituals are about navigating the present and orienting us to the future when we have lost our way. Navigating the present is where rebalancing the world comes in, for individuals, for cultures, maybe even for the world, because the present is all we have. The past and future do not exist existentially. Only this moment exists. So ceremonies at their best are ways of engaging the present with our bodies more than our monkey minds. Living in the past or in the future is often called the source of our sickness. And I can say that the most unwell I have ever been, psychologically and spiritually, is when I have been connected to something unreal, such as the past or the future. We will take up reality and unreality in another lecture. This divergence of life and time is precisely the source of Teo's illness and ceremony. He cannot escape the past and how he cursed the rain. He cannot escape the future where there is no water and everything is dying. He needs a good ceremony to bring him, specifically his body, to the present and to himself. He needs to be rebalanced because his mind has thrown him off balance. What does such a rebalancing look like? It looks like what we've been talking about throughout the series, letting an old story go instead of grasping it like flotsam in a sea. Opening to a new story, no matter how painful or confusing it can be. Recognizing monsters for the symbols that they are, and aligning ourselves to the emergent reality as it becomes clear. And while there's a certain theoretical symmetry to all these ideas, ceremonies ground these abstractions in our bodies and in other bodies around us. Put another way, ceremonies center us in the real instead of in the obsolete fictions we're carrying around in our heads. What is real is sacred, and what is sacred is real. Peoples from all over the world have recognized that we live in unreality most of the time. Stories and rituals that have long since become empty of meaning, but to which we cling. What ritual does is put our bodies in touch with the sacred, that which is the deepest reality and ultimate meaning of our existence. What are the processes that make ceremonies work, to heal, to move us into a different state of being, to make us come together in community, to recenter us in the real? Fortunately, we have a profound text that asked and answered those very questions. Victor Turner, a Scottish anthropologist, recognized Van Gennep's insights into ritual and broadened and deepened them. Turner's genius involved bringing a humanistic perspective to the sometimes cold anthropological analyses of his peers. In doing so, he added two profound aspects of ceremony: liminality and communitas. Turner's 1960 book, The Ritual Process, is one of those books that will be perennially relevant because of his insights into the nature of change and the forms we use to mark it in ritual. For a terrific exploration of liminality, I encourage you to watch the lecture by Dr. Raina Manuel Paris on this channel, where she explores Turner's concept of liminality with her unique, fascinating, and relevant insights. As she notes, the world itself is in a liminal zone right now, an in-between space and time, where one way of being and the stories that uphold it are passing, but a new way of being and its stories have not yet emerged. While Van Gennep first introduced the idea of the liminal stage, it was Turner who saw in it the wellspring of wisdom regarding change itself. He notes regarding liminality, liminal entities are neither here nor there. They are betwixt and between the positions assigned and arrayed by law, custom, convention, and ceremony. As such, their ambiguous and indeterminate attributes are expressed by a rich variety of symbols in the many societies that ritualize social and cultural transitions. Thus, liminality is frequently likened to death, to being in the womb, to invisibility, to darkness, to bisexuality, to the wilderness, and to an eclipse of the sun or moon. As you can see in this brief description, liminality is all that is not ordered, an opening to chaos, which is exactly what change feels like. Liminality is loss without a story to explain it, a loss of self and orientation, and an incarnation of that loss in the body in the forms of emotions, sickness, scarification, etc. In a liminal zone, we recognize that our reality, so certain and fixed in the previous world, are fictions we can live by only for so long, because the world is always in flux and our stories always lag behind the changes in the world. Liminality is a gift, though it feels like a punishment. Here in 2020 and in the pandemic, we are, for the first time in decades, experiencing a global liminality where we are all in between together. This moment is rife with anxiety, fear, even rage, and this moment is sacred, because it is teaching us that our old stories are out of line with the world, and what we need is a good ceremony to bring it all back into balance. But we cannot live in liminality. It is simply too traumatic, and it is a mistake to profane the process of liminality. We must embrace it, wait, and remain open to the new world. Not to put too fine a point on it, but Americans' inability to wait and embrace liminal uncertainty has only prolonged and exacerbated our liminality. Had we been patient and adhered to the advice of our guides, thank you, Dr. Fauci, we would already be further along on our journey, as other countries are. Officials who have refused mitigation efforts have simply been clinging to an obsolete reality, one that included them being in power and being reelected. Their inaction is equivalent to an initiate who refuses to undergo a rite of passage. He remains in a world that is no longer there, and he and his peers will be developmentally delayed, while those who turn into the liminality progress into a new state of being and a new world, a new reality. Those who remain in chaos and uncertainty until the process is complete share the unique bond of having had a common traumatic but sacred experience. They recognize one another as initiates who have become adepts. While a nod may suffice to mark that familiarity, typically a whole new lexicon of symbols reserved for the group resonate with meaning and are shared among them, but not with those who failed to go on the journey. This kind of being together is the basic idea of communitas. Turner uses the Latin word to distinguish the experience from simply living in the same place without the effects of ritual. For Turner, communitas is the centripetal force that brings us together as human beings, while liminality is a centrifugal force that flings us into isolation and imbalance. We move from liminality to communitas in a kind of dialectic of disorder and structure, with each informing and shaping the other. Turner writes, "From all this, I infer that for individuals and groups, social life is a type of dialectical process that involves successive experience of high and low, communitas and structure, homogeneity and differentiation, equality and inequality. The passage from lower to higher status is through a limbo of statuslessness. In such a process, the opposites, as it were, constitute one another and are mutually indispensable. Furthermore, since any concrete tribal society is made up of multiple personae, groups, and categories, each of which has its own developmental cycle, at a given moment, many incumbencies of fixed positions coexist with many passages between positions. In other words, each individual's life experience contains alternating exposure to structure and communitas, and to states and transitions." Let us understand Turner very clearly here, because our notions of community may elide his notion of communitas. While looking and feeling very much like the community I experienced with my neighbors or the visitors at PRS, communitas is typically more profound and even radical. Communitas is a deep awareness of our fragile existence in a web of relation. Liminality exposes us to the loss of that relation and its attendant anxiety and fear. We live with both because life is dynamic, not static. It flows rather than is. While we need the stability of communitas for psychic health and even physical well-being, we also need liminality to process the inevitable change that will come. As Turner elucidates, ritual is also, among other things, profoundly political. Listen to Turner explaining the concept by current events at his time of writing. In modern Western society, the values of communitas are strikingly present in the literature and behavior of what came to be known as the Beat Generation, who were succeeded by the hippies, who in turn have a junior division known as the teeny boppers. These are the cool members of the adolescent and young adult categories, which do not have advantages of national rites of passage, who opt out of the status-bound social order and acquire the stigmata of the lowly, dressing like bums, itinerant in their habits, folk in their musical tastes, and menial in the casual employment they undertake. They stress personal relationships rather than social obligations, and regard sexuality as polymorphic, an instrument of immediate communitas rather than as the basis for an enduring, structured social tie. We see then that communitas is radical and revolutionary by its very nature. It must be, because it is nothing short of a reconfiguration of our individual lives and the culture that holds them. There is a certain symmetry in our recent catastrophes that has already been mapped by Turner. The loss of stories, the appearance of monsters, the promulgation of conspiracy, the emergence of protests. These all speak to both liminality and communitas, that is, to change, and change always means a shift in power relations. Turner writes, communitas breaks in through the interstices of structure, in liminality, at the edges of structure, in marginality, and from beneath structure, in inferiority. It is almost everywhere held to be sacred or holy, possibly because it transgresses or dissolves the norms that govern structured and institutionalized relationships, and is accompanied by experiences of unprecedented potency. The processes of leveling and stripping often appear to flood their subjects with affect, that is, emotion. Turner's description of the interplay between communitas and liminality resonates deeply for our time, when the interstices of structure are unveiled and the sins of old dogma and ideologies are called for in the service of the sacred. When Turner notes that the ritual process floods its subjects with effect, he uncovers another feature of ceremonies that are greatly missed, and that is the expression of deep emotion in the service of the sacred. Where is it in our culture that we are not only free but encouraged to allow our feelings to flow freely? In pre-pandemic existence, there were a few such places, and they were all ritual spaces: a music performance, a sporting event, a therapist's office. Certainly, some religious organizations allow for such a release of emotion, and African American churches in particular have recognized the dynamics of ritual better than most. The tensions involved in transformation need a vehicle for their release, and when this happens in a group of people in a ritual setting, the result is life-changing and profoundly emotional. As I write these words, I am called back, as I often am, to the work of the current poet laureate of the United States, Muskogee Creek writer and musician Joy Harjo. Her poetry is ritualistic itself, especially when she performs it as music with her band Poetic Justice. In I Give You Back, Harjo depicts more powerfully than I can the ritual process of liminality and emotion. Watch, listen, and take stock of your own emotions as she shares her ritual release of fear.
Thank you. This poem is a poem to get rid of fear, and it works. I have before and after pictures. I release you, my beautiful and terrible fear. I release you. You were my beloved and hated twin, but now I don't know you as myself. I release you with all the pain I would know at the death of my children. You are not my blood anymore. I give you back to the soldiers who burned down my home, beheaded my children, raped and sodomized my brothers and sisters. I give you back to those who stole the food from our plates when we were starving. I release you, fear, because you were born, and I was born with eyes that can never close. I release you. I release you. I release you. I release you. I am not afraid to be angry. I am not afraid to rejoice. I am not afraid to be hungry. I am not afraid to be full. I am not afraid to be black. I am not afraid to be white. I am not afraid to be hated. I am not afraid to be loved, to be loved, to be loved. Fear. Oh, you have choked me, but I gave you the leash. You have gutted me, but I gave you the knife. You have devoured me, but I laid myself across the fire. I take myself back, fear. You are not my shadow any longer. I won't hold you in my hands. You can't live in my eyes, my ears, my voice, my belly, or in my heart. My heart, my heart, my heart, my heart, my heart, my heart, my heart. Come here, fear. I am alive. And you are so afraid of dying.
In the novel Ceremony, Teo too finds release from his fear and guilt. A refrain appears to him regularly during his extended ceremony. You know it's not easy. And it isn't. But when we get there, when we are released from our fear and anger and guilt and shame, when we come out of the liminal zone and emerge into a new story, a new world, we are flooded with emotion, as is Teo. Listen to this description. He cried with relief he felt at finally seeing the pattern, the way all the stories fit together, the old stories, the war stories, their stories, to become the story that was still being told. He was not crazy. He had never been crazy. He had only seen and heard the world as it always was. No boundaries, only transitions through all distances and time. To see the pattern is to be well again. To see the way all the stories fit together, the new ones, the old ones, to become the current one, that is the fullness of our humanity and the comfort of being alive. To see oneself not as a self, but as part of a communitas that is moved into and out of liminality together. This is wisdom. You are not crazy if you're in a liminal zone. A sacred voice is calling you. You are just in between stories. A new story is being born within and around you. Let it be born, and let us celebrate it together. Thank you for your attention.